ma anche ora so che qualunque cosa chiederai a Dio, Dio te la darà.
This is the body of a priest called Padre Pio. He died on September the 23rd, 1968. A humble and very private man, he dominated the lives of tens of thousands of sane and ordinary people who simply believed he was a saint. He bore in his body the bleeding and agonizing marks of the 5 great wounds of Christ. More famous than any other priest, he lived most of his life in an obscure Franciscan convent in southern Italy, and from it he challenged the unbelief of the whole world. Padre Pio was born to this country in the town of Pietrelcina. His life promised nothing but harsh work and the anonymity of peasant death. Instead, he lies in the light of candles lapped in marble. His parents were cheerful and generous and poor and illiterate and, of course, pious. They farmed a small holding and lived in this house. His father had to leave it twice to go to America and work to get money for a little extra education for his children. The boy grew up here precociously devout. He wanted to become a priest, and he chose the Franciscan order, which embraces humility and poverty and does not reject the streets. He started the process of becoming a priest when he was 15 years old. For 8 years, he studied and prayed and meditated. He was often ill. He fasted for days on end, eating nothing but the wafer at Mass. He suffered frequent fevers and tuberculosis. At 23, he was ordained priest, though, because of his health and in the expectation of his early death, he was sent home for several years. The stories about him grew, and they made his superiors uneasy. He was tormented by the devil, they said. He took an hour and a half to say a half-hour Mass. He had ecstasies, and a suspicious and impatient church packed him off to the remote convent of San Giovanni Rotondo, where he stayed until he died. It was a quiet, rather primitive and utterly undistinguished place. This was the backwater of the church. Yet he transformed the backwater into a center for international religious tourism. And he did it by being himself. Here he is a one-man industry, a tourist trap, a shrine. Hotels, bars, curio shops have flourished on his reputation alone. Of course, such commercialism and offensive vulgarity often attends places reputed to be the scenes of holy wonders. It shocks non-believers more than the faithful. But here it all attended a man who was alive at the time and whose remarkable attributes had been frowned on by his own church. But the prudent or the cool theological approach to religion means nothing to this part of Italy. Their nature is both violent and submissive, so is their religion. They have a matter-of-fact acceptance of God and miracles. They seem content to leave the alleviation of their miseries to the Blessed Virgin and the company of saints. Of course, when they do leave their dry hills and go north for work, like budding flowers introduced to water, they often blossom into communists. But here the wonderful comes close to the natural. It does not make sense of them, but they have a faith that is as old and dark and strong as any in Europe. They are seized not by the love, but by the power and wonder of God.
And we're here. We're all here together, looking for Christ. We find him very much alive. Alive in each other, alive in their joy in Christ here. Right, Vera, haven't we? And we know we're going to have our miracle.
Miracles are nothing new for San Giovanni Rotondo, and the people claimed for Padre Pio that he worked miracles. The same claims were made for him all over the world. It is said that he had an unnerving insight into men's souls, that he healed the sick, that he was capable of bilocation, of appearing simultaneously in more than one place, that at times he could send to those in distress an enchanting odor that brought comfort. One case where a miracle is claimed is that of Gemma de Giorgi. She is the girl in the dark glasses. She was born blind without pupils to her eyes. She insists that Padre Pio made her see, and she still has no pupils. Her case has been minutely examined by doctors, and no convincing explanation is given. She lives now under religious discipline and was not allowed to talk to us. Or there is the documented case of this Italian railway worker, Giuseppe Canapone. He was involved in a car crash shortly after the war. His left thigh was fractured. When the femur healed, it was found that his knee had locked rigid and gave atrocious pain. For 3 years, he was in and out of hospital and underwent several operations, but they achieved nothing, and the doctors gave up. Eventually, on the insistence of his wife, Canapone reluctantly agreed in 1948 to go to Padre Pio. At confession, Padre Pio rebuked him for his bad language and ungovernable temper. And he realized that he was kneeling, that his crutch and stick were no longer needed. However, in this case, there is a report by the doctors who again examined the cured knee. They summed up: "In our opinion, then, the unexpected and sudden ability of our patient Canapone to achieve a full range of movements with his knee is an exceptional occurrence which cannot be explained by our present scientific knowledge. But in most cases, evidence is hard to come by because the Church dislikes the idea of a living, wonder-working saint and prefers to keep the evidence under lock and key, perhaps for public examination at a future date." Then there is the case of a 37-year-old woman called Lucia Bellodi, who lives in this house in Modena. At the age of 15, she developed an illness which was diagnosed as diabetes insipidus. She had a continuous crippling headache. She vomited frequently and began to drink enormous quantities of water, sometimes as much as 300 or 400 pints a day. After 4 years, the doctors gave up hope, and she was sent to this dismal house for the aged, presumably to die. The nurse who looked after her told us that she could only pray that the girl would die to put her out of her agony. One night, after a particularly violent attack, Lucia woke up screaming, saying that she had seen Padre Pio, who told her that she would recover. From that moment, she recovered completely and now leads a normal, healthy life. Although Lucia said that her priest would not allow her to be filmed, she did give us a copy of a medical report. Both it and the nurse who had looked after her confirmed the gravity of her illness and the instant recovery. We showed the report to doctors in this country. Their opinion is that it gives insufficient evidence to substantiate the diagnosis of diabetes insipidus, and a compulsive water-drinking hysteria cannot be ruled out. So there remains that element of doubt that so often attends a claimed miracle. But it is not only the poor and the Italian who make such claims for Padre Pio. Here is a Scottish banker who lives and works in Milan.
I wouldn't be here myself today had it not been for Padre Pio. I came out of the war in a pretty parlous condition. I'd had an incipient stroke, partial stroke. I had had heart trouble, and he cured that. However, I'd prefer to speak about other cases that I've seen. I've seen a man who was blind in both eyes, and he was blind because his eyes had been eaten by disease so that they were like shriveled peas. And I've had that man sitting in my office looking at me with his eyes completely reformed. I knew a man down there who had cancer of the throat. He was dying of it. He couldn't speak above a whisper. And he was sitting in my office along with the man who had been blind, talking at the top of his voice and smoking American cigarettes.
In Canterbury, there is a Cecil Humphrey Smith who was a research chemist. After a car crash, he suffered headaches so severe that he could not work and the doctors could not help him. He went disbelievingly to Padre Pio.
As I went in the room, Bernardo said, "Kneel down and kiss his hands." And the old man tapped me on the head. And from then on, after all these years of excruciating pains, I haven't had any trouble, with exceptions that I can tell you about later. Well, this was absolutely remarkable. And I wasn't looking for a miracle at the time. I wasn't looking for anything extraordinary. I had hospital treatment before and after, with a scientific background and considerable amount of skepticism after hearing the stories about him. It was incredible. I just couldn't believe that this could happen. I don't think that unless you've experienced pain of that magnitude suddenly disappearing, you can really appreciate what did happen.
The church doesn't very much like talk of miracles, so long as the person concerned is alive. She likes her saints dead, and she likes to talk about miracles when they're safely tucked away in paradise. However, one can only say what one has seen. And I have never experienced Padre Pio's bilocation. But I have very good friends whose word I couldn't possibly doubt, who have experienced it directly.
On one particular evening, we were in a bedroom. The atmosphere was tense with anxiety. And suddenly I looked up, I don't know, no particular reason, and there was Padre Pio, no doubt about it at all, as real as you are. And immediately an overwhelming feeling of calm and peace, security, one just can't explain it. It's an extraordinary feeling came over me. My wife was completely overwhelmed with happiness. Exactly what her experience was, I don't know. We didn't talk about it afterwards. There wasn't any sort of spiriting of coming and going. He was there, and then he wasn't there, but he was just one of us here in Canterbury.
Those who have experienced Padre Pio tend to be without any sort of doubt, but in fact, no one anywhere is under any obligation to believe such things. To some, they are evidence of a divine intervention, to others, suspicious or inaccurately observed natural phenomena. As well as the enigma of all miracles, there is a random, apparently illogical incidents. Why, for example, pick on Lazarus? But extraordinary things did happen around Padre Pio, maybe a little too often for really convincing explanation. Here is Father Michael Hollings, Catholic chaplain at Oxford University.
I'm a great believer in miracles, but I don't really think they're important. And I think you want really to look back at Christ and see what he did, and see that normally he did it for a particular purpose, to restore somebody's faith or to prove the point of who he was. And perhaps this could be the same attitude in regard to Padre Pio. I personally would think that he did. This sounds rather condescending. I think he would have worked miracles. I have no doubt of that at all. But to me, he didn't work any. And the only time that I was really involved in the sort of thing which gets everything distorted was when I was serving the Mass. And at a particular time, just before the communion, the host is broken. Now, Padre Pio's hands were sore. He broke the host, and the host fell into the chalice. I saw the host in the chalice when I gave him water for the ablutions after the communion. And there it was. As soon as we arrived out of the church afterwards, my companion and I, everyone said, "Miracolo, miracolo." So we said, "Why?" The host was there, and then it was gone. So we said, "No, it wasn't. It was down in the chalice." "No, it wasn't. No, it wasn't." She said. And so a miracle had occurred, which in fact hadn't occurred. And there is always the danger of this sort of thing happening. But from what I heard when I was there myself, and from talking to some of the members of the community, and from talking to doctors, I would think that some of the miracles attributed to Padre Pio would be verifiable if and when they get to doing something about canonization of him.
Whatever the truth, countless people believed that Padre Pio had been given extraordinary powers. His walls were surrounded, besieged by thousands of people who wanted something. The convent was a fortress defended by the friars. All day long they waited on Padre Pio's prayers and blessings. They demanded he hear their confession or say a mass for them. And the spectacle of such a hunger was not always edifying. At the still center of this storm was a very simple man. For recreation, he sometimes sat in a parlor and prayed. This is he. We had to film him surreptitiously. He was a quiet man who disliked the excesses of his people and who hated publicity. He seldom left the confines of his convent. He was never its superior. And because, not of what he did, but of what happened to him, he incurred the active displeasure of his church, which can be as opaque and impersonal as any civil service. In the 1920s, he was forbidden to preach, hear confession, or say mass in public. It happened again in the 30s. In 1960, he was coldly investigated by the Vatican, but the church disliked the emotional religiosity and the commercialism that surrounded him. He did not complain, he simply sat it out and obeyed. The convent was his prison, and even at the end of his life, his day was as harsh as that of a prisoner. He rose at 2:30. He went to the sacristy at 4, said mass at 5. When he was younger, he sometimes heard confessions for 12 hours. In old age, he still spent 2.5 hours at them. He ate a meager lunch with his brethren and rested. He attended the evening service. He took a little food again, and at 6:30 he went to bed. Because of pain, he slept little, and he took no drugs to ease his nights. All the interstices of his days were filled with prayer. He had letters to answer, visitors to receive, and all these slow and agonized activities were expressions of his self-appointed task of recognizing the existence of God.
The human side, I think, came out most of all when we were very lucky and were allowed to go into the convent and to be with him a certain amount when he was, as it were, off duty. You can imagine it, perhaps, Italian garden with cypress trees, warm sun, evening atmosphere. A few of the brothers about, one or two of his really old friends, one or two of the people who'd been with him, I suppose, most of his life in that monastery, and then one or two of us who'd been allowed in. And he used to sit there generally, and the people would come, people from the garden would come and kiss his hand, and he'd chat away, they'd ask him questions, he'd laugh. To me it was, I think it would seem what I would think it to have been with Christ and his disciples, in a sense, because there were times when he could be very firm, and he'd put a very firm line about something. There were other times when he was laughing and joking. There was no sense of people just kowtowing to him. They'd question him, they'd contradict him, and there was nevertheless a tremendous peace, a joy about him.
Each morning he said the mass of the day appointed by his church. He said it with a painful slowness that no one minded, but he had to sit at the altar to celebrate. He said it in front of a great crowd as if he were utterly alone. This was routine, and yet he invested it with a drama and intensity that no one who saw it ever forgot. When he had said his daily mass, a few men were allowed into the sacristy to watch him go by. They behaved better than the women. And what did they come to see? An old man set apart for them by the fact that he bore in his body the torturing wounds of Christ. The 5 wounds which symbolize the crucifixion to the faithful, 2 in the hands, 2 in the feet, and 1 in the side. He had these, and they often bled a cup of blood a day. And they were an imposition and an agony he never displayed. In fact, they saw a cheerful, occasionally impatient peasant, an invalid with a strong voice, bright eyes, and a face of elderly beauty. St. Francis of Assisi was the first to bear such stigmata. Padre Pio was only the second man to bear them in perfect form. It is accepted, however, that more than 100 women had suffered or embraced them. The Catholic Church approaches such wounds with polite embarrassment. There are 3 possible causes for such phenomena. They could be caused by God for the encouragement of the faithful or by the devil for their confusion. They could be the result of fraud, innocent or unconscious. Or they could be caused, and this is the favorite explanation, by an hysteria, a sort of crucifixion complex born of a passionate sympathy for Jesus on the cross and reproduced quite unconsciously by emotion upon the body of the lover of Christ crucified. All the medical explanations in the great cases are inadequate. What happened, and the evidence that it did happen is overwhelming, is that Padre Pio in 1918 was saying his thanksgiving after Mass before the crucifix at San Giovanni Rotondo. It is a dramatic work of art that dignifies the degradation of the death. 3 years earlier, he had believed that he had had the stigmata imposed invisibly and suffered the pain without the wounds. Suddenly he cried out and fell backwards, and his brother friars saw him marked as if he had been terribly tortured. The wounds were now as obvious as sin. There exists only one official photograph of his hands. It was taken after medical examination and under the orders of his superiors. It was attested as genuine by an Italian commissioner for oaths. The doctors who saw him did not agree on the causes. We sent all the medical evidence available to a London physician in psychological medicine. He had taken a special interest in this type of symptom. He is not a Catholic. We pressed him for an explanation.
If we imagine the Franciscan fire in 1915, on the day of the commemoration of the stigmatization of the founder of his order, St. Francis, wrapped in prayer, focusing his whole mind on the saint, perhaps striving to identify with him. If we remember that Padre Pio has often been seen in trance-like states, we must ask ourselves, could these wounds be caused by autosuggestion or by self-hypnosis? The second possibility is that the wounds were self-inflicted. Now, to say that a person wounds himself is not necessarily to say that he's a swindler or a charlatan. I myself and some of my colleagues have seen people who have shown the 5 wounds believing them to be stigmatization. But in all these cases, it has been finally proved that they have been self-inflicted, although the person might have been quite unaware of this fact. Well, this then perhaps is the case of the devil's advocate. The 2 possibilities, autosuggestion and self-mutilation. How convincing is this case? I have discussed the evidence with a number of colleagues who are very eminent in this field. And there are a number of features of the wounds of Padre Pio which are inexplicable to me. I can find no accounts of bleeding being produced either by hypnosis or by autosuggestion. It is most remarkable that wounds which have been self-inflicted should show no signs of reddening, inflammation, infection, or signs of healing over a prolonged period. As a psychiatrist, I must remain in a state of profound uncertainty.
Padre Pio was preoccupied with the sacrificial death of his Saviour, and nowadays we tend to approach such a preoccupation with a suspicious skepticism. He was centered upon this suffering God-made man, and because of this he extended compassion to the creatures of God. His compassion came from his conception of this very personalized God. He was a lonely and tormented little priest, yet he exerted an extraordinary, not in the least sinister influence. Despite the baroquely emotional trappings, he was as sensible as a vicar in an English slum. His weapon was not sociology, but the confessional. This dispensing of God's mercy they reduced to a system, rather like getting tickets for a cup tie.
Sì. Confessarmi con Padre Pio.
Benissimo.
Piuttosto desidererei sapere, vero, più o meno quanti giorni ci vogliono.
Beh, occhio e croce ci vorranno 5-6 giorni.
People came from all over the world and waited days for the privilege of this, one of the 7 sacraments of the Roman Church. In it, a person in inviolable secrecy has to tell a priest even his most disgusting acts.
C'è molta gente, vero, c'è molta affluenza, vero,
Te le impari.
Va bene, va bene.
The penitents who queued to see Padre Pio were priests and scholars and artists as well as peasants. And it was the most sophisticated who sometimes feared his insight and bolted at the door. Padre Pio had an almost clairvoyant understanding of the human heart, and this at times could mean an ordeal as well as a comfort. In San Giovanni, we met an Italian man who drove his own Mercedes. He had been persuaded to come by a friend, and because he was naggingly dissatisfied with himself, he waited 6 frightened days to go to confession to Padre Pio. The day after, he told us what happened.
And I say the ritual Catholic words start in the confession. Father, forgive me because I have sinned. And he answered with the ritual words. How long have it been since you had your last confession? Sincerely, I didn't remember. And I said, 10, 15 years. And he said, where have you been? But the intonation of his question was so sincere, so curious, that I answered right away. I've been in Florence, in Rome. But in that moment, I realized that I had been also far from God. And he, with a very sweet voice, so gentle to me, he says, well, Noel, he said, change your life. Look for another confessor and go in peace. All this takes probably 8-10 seconds. And I wait 6 days for this 10 seconds. I turned away. I had so many things to ask. But this father, with 2 words, and probably more than with the words, but with the way he told those words to me, the way he looked at me, answered to all my questions.
This was essentially a personal and intimate work like that of a doctor. But at 5 o'clock every morning, Padre Pio said his Mass publicly in the convent church. Pilgrims from all over the world crowded into the square in front of the new church and waited and prayed. His Mass was the great event of their day. It was also the most important in his. There was excitement and curiosity and local pride and great faith, and always the jealous sense of the privilege of being there. They swept awe and respect aside. If the church had tried to stop them, they would have swept aside the church. We filmed this on his feast day, that of St. Pius, the fifth pope of that name. He allowed himself some of the pomps of the Roman Church. But even among these Counter-Reformation splendors, he stayed undistracted and alone. He might almost have been a hermit in his cell. For Mass, he took off the mittens that all day covered his hands, though he wore the sleeves of his alb deliberately long. He said it slowly and in physical pain. He could not properly close his hands. The gestures which brisk young curates perform in the expectation of a good breakfast were done as if his salvation depended on them. In fact, he did what all good priests do every morning of their lives. But people watched this as if it were a miracle as well as a Mass. Of course, to Catholics, the Mass is itself a miracle every time it is done. But the adulation rang hollow at times in the face of the poverty around him. The ceremonies of religion, had they been a substitute for charity and constructive work, the poverty of his district was black and ugly, and there seemed no local cure for it. And yet his faithful all over the world had sent him money. Indeed, they did not know how to spend it all. The friars began to carve a way of the cross out of the rock. There was unemployment, inadequate education and agriculture, primitive housing. But they were simple men, not the sort to upturn society. They ordered a monument to God's suffering on earth. In anticipation of his death, they built a memorial room and a crypt for his body. It was a dubious consolation for a sick old man. But the real memorial to Padre Pio's name was a hospital for his own people. It is huge and very modern, and it was the one project specifically undertaken at his request. An agency of the United Nations gave £140,000. Enemies said it was because NATO planned an airbase close by. Mayor LaGuardia of New York collected $400,000. It is the finest hospital in southern Italy, and wealth can buy no privileges here. Treatment is free for the very poor. But it could have been more wisely built close to a big town and on sounder roads. The accounts were muddled. Contractors did as they pleased. There was too much marble. Again, the Vatican had to step in to restore order. No one accused Padre Pio of profiting by it, though his political enemies called him the richest monk in the world.
Benedetta fra le donne e benedetto il frutto del seno tuo Gesù. Santa Maria, Madre di Dio, prega per noi peccatori, adesso e all'ora nostra morte.
But the women who waited outside his walls every evening cared for none of these things. They concentrated on the possibility that he was palpable evidence that God lives and intervenes. And there is a hunger for miraculous evidence. There is also a fear of its implication. People do clutch at props to shore up their faith. Nothing could be more comforting than to be utterly certain and to have physical evidence to back it up. There is a ferocity in this hunger, particularly among people who have, to our eyes, little else with which to adorn their lives. It is not the pure stuff of religion, only its byproduct. But the sophisticated can share the basis of this faith and occasionally accept the evidence that others find offensive to their unbelief. All this for an old sick friar who has lived his life in the only way he knows. So every evening, women from the town waited, hoping and praying for that sign which never seems to come in a finally convincing manner. Yet it had come for them as convincing as the existence of debt and the certainty of death. For him, alone and close to his own death, this was a purgatory, not a comfort.
He hates praise. One of his greatest attributes is true humility. And maybe it's easier for Padre Pio to be humble because he understands so much that the rest of us don't understand. And he's very aware of the gifts that have been given to him, but he in no way attributes these to himself. And I remember on one occasion, after the death of Dr. Sanguinetti, the man who built the hospital there, Padre Pio was broken. He was in terrible condition. And I said to him, but I should think our friend Dr. Sanguinetti has gone to his reward. He said, oh yes, of course he has. But he said, also the heart demands its part, not only the mind. And he was terribly broken up. And I tried to bring him out of this by making deliberate assaults on his humility, telling him about the books that had been published and what people had been saying and so on and so forth. And this worried him tremendously. He even wept. He said, "You're all so deluded, so terribly deluded. I am terrified to die because I'm not stupid. I know the gifts that God has given me. But if the lowest scoundrel in this world had received these gifts, he'd have made much better use of them than I have."
His life, in fact, was no fleeing from reality, as the reality he saw was hardly that which is generally accepted. As death came closer, the walls around him grew higher, and he received few visitors. And although the crowd still surged at his gate, he was as lonely in old age as he had been in childhood. Every afternoon he attended the evening service. This is he, 2 weeks before death, praying alone above the melancholy din of Italian village Catholicism. This, rather than all the stories about him, was the point of his life, this studied, motionless contemplation of God, this kneeling alone with the alone. When they took these pictures in the gallery of the church, the camera team felt obtruders on his special privacy. To a Christian, this apparent relationship with a personalized God is still the greatest thing a man can achieve on earth. And it is apparently the prerogative of no single faith. It defies explanation. It demands the poetic language of love and sometimes even of sexuality to convey the intensity of the emotion. There is nothing selfish or self-indulgent about this. It can make complete sense only to a believer, though a non-believer can admit the authenticity of this experience, which is called mystical. For him, God was as real as the pain in his hands, feet, and side. Other people can only stand afar off and wonder at it. In the end, his small, imperfect world was taken by surprise. Our filming was completed. His life had reached a climax. His brethren had celebrated 50 years of the Stigmata. They had consecrated the memorial room and crypt, ready for his relics and his body. He had spent his usual constrained and busy day, and then, early on a Monday morning, he died of an old man's bronchial trouble, gently apparently, and with an ease that had not been his in his life. He lay in the church built with the money given to him. They crowded to his lying in state as they did to his masses. But this time it was personal grief rather than religious greed that drew the vast and patient crowd.
Rendere grazie sempre di tutti a te, Signore Padre Santo, Dio onnipotente ed eterno, per Cristo nostro Signore. In lui
So they took leave of his body, and still his stigmata were not on display. Something like 100,000 people filed past, and this time he could not protest. This was only one small part of his international horde of faithful friends. Perhaps his real miracle was to have exerted such an influence from behind such enclosing walls and in so remote a part of Europe. His influence was not only over peasants born to believe, but over professors and princes of the church, over journalists and artists and politicians and businessmen. They grieved with a peasant's devotion. He left the world lapped in love. They carried his body down from the church and all through the town and back up the hill to the square in front of the church. It was a sort of triumph, not of death, but of the repudiation of the vulgarity and ugliness of death.
Eterno riposo donarico Signore, e splenda a Lui la luce perpetua, riposi in pace. La sua anima e le anime tutti i fedeli defunti, e la misericordia di Dio riposino in pace.
There arises for Catholics the question whether he will ever be declared a saint. At least economically, this is profoundly important to San Giovanni Rotondo. But even though they buried him with a ritual splendor, with the general of his order and 2 cardinals and all his brethren to celebrate the mysteries over his body and to pray for the repose of his soul, the Church maintains its wall of discreet and ancient silence. We, of course, can give no final verdict. We cannot predict the future of his name. But here for certain was a man, good in a rare way, wise beyond his learning, who suffered joyfully and emulated his God with all his power. And countless people were better people for his existence. If the word holy means anything, Padre Pio was that.